Hey, welcome to another edition of the Nonprofit Leadership Studio. Another great program for you tonight. Tonight we're talking with Diane McGehee. She's the Executive Director of Together in Hope. Diane, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And we're going to do a whole new hour of questions for you. And so.
We have worked in El Salvador right now, the gang violence, which is bringing so many of these unaccompanied minors and families across our borders, has made El Salvador.
It's just hard to work there.
Hard to work there. I was there in March, and it's just, it's difficult right now. So, but we work, our work.
You do some work in Ethiopia?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we focus on education, on nutritional support, and on micro business development.
Wow. And so you're based here in the United States. So you're raising all the money here, and then you have all these little groups over there that you're sort of sending it to, or how does it work?
Well, so what we do is we go in only by invitation. I was a pastor of a Filipino congregation here in the United States and was invited to come over to work in the Philippines. And so by invitation, we were asked to come in the first community. We have 3 communities we work with there to help them discern what could be done and how we might work together to develop some micro businesses to help with education for the children, as well as hunger issues, basic nutritional things. So we only go in by invitation, and then we build local leadership. We have no U.S. staff on the ground.
I think that's sort of an extraordinary thing, isn't it?
Because our model is that we leave as little footprint as we can. Our goal is to empower that community so that they don't need us. So we try to go in with seed money, and then help the community develop programs that it can continue to sustain.
So how much money are you raising every year to do all this stuff?
Well, actually, it doesn't take a whole lot.
Yeah.
We run all...
Especially when you're employing nationals, I guess,
That's right.
Yeah.
So U.S. money goes a lot farther. So our entire budget is about $40,000 a year.
How do you do that?
Well, all of our staff here is volunteer.
Yeah.
So even I have a full-time job, and I volunteer as the executive director.
So you basically have 2 full-time jobs.
I do.
Yeah.
My other nonprofit work that I do, which is my paying job, is with the United Methodist Church, and I work on social justice issues. So immigration is one of those issues. I was telling you, we just opened free legal clinics for undocumented immigrants who can't afford for legal services. But those complement each other because the Philippines has huge immigration issues too. And so it's a lot, but it's what keeps me alive and what I care about. And so
yeah. So tell me, let's go back to the beginning. How did you get started in this? You grew up in Georgia?
I did. I grew up in South Georgia in the 60s. My father was a mental health chaplain. And he came in to a population of 5,000 and realized that the only staff he had were Anglo-Protestants, and there were Cuban refugees. In his population there were Jews, there were African Americans, and so he revamped the whole staff, integrated the staff, and the Ku Klux Klan was not happy.
Yeah.
My dad got involved in the civil rights movement. I remember that as a young child. One of my earliest memories as a first grader was watching them burn a cross on our front yard as a warning to my dad. And my dad saying to me that we are called, and I happen to be a Christian, we are called to stand up for people who have no voice. And he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. And so that justice for those who don't have a voice, who are marginalized by society.
So you come from pretty good genes.
I do.
Yeah. So it's sort of. So tell me about your academic career. You went to Mercer College, and then from there?
Went to Mercer University.
Mercer University, okay.
And then went to Princeton Seminary and was working in the inner city in Trenton, New Jersey. And I had grown up in rural poverty, had seen it, but I had never seen that kind of inner city poverty. And so I was working in the inner city where kids were coming home without food, without parents at home, because both parents were trying to just make enough to get by, where you had urban white flight, and so a whole new community coming in that people didn't know how to relate to, and that sent me to law school because I felt like the church didn't have the tools to actually begin to address some of the justice issues that it was trying to address.
Wow. And after getting your law degree, what was your first, did you immediately go into public interest law, or
Well, actually,
were you tempted by corporate work at all?
I did do some corporate work. I got out of law school and found myself the single mother of 4 boys. So I had 4 children to support.
Wow.
Came to Houston, which it was a very progressive legal market even that long ago. I graduated from law school in '87 and made a deal. I said, I will forgo salary, you give me benefits, you pay me for the work that you can actually bill of my time, and I get to be at home with my children. That's before we had all this technology. But I can say that most of my legal work was representing people at the margins, and so it fulfilled that call on me until I could get to a place where I could do it more intentionally.
Now, Diane, let's say you're writing your big book on leadership, the Diane McGehee leadership book. What are some of the chapters going to be about?
The first thing I would say is that you need to be willing to be a member of the community you're seeking to serve in terms of building relationships. Now, that's harder when you're doing international, but it's about relationship and it's about learning to listen to the community. It's easy for us, and I think it's a mistake that a lot of nonprofits make, especially when they go international, but also here, is that we have an idea in our heads and a narrative that we tell about how to fix this. These communities don't need to be fixed. They need resources that we have, but they also have resources. And until you immerse yourself in a community and can learn to listen to it, then you don't know what resources they have and what it would look like for them to be empowered as opposed to dependent on us. So that, I'd say that's number one. Particularly for me, most of my experience is working nonprofits with marginalized or poor communities. There's nonprofits in the arts and those kind of things. But
Sure.
so I would say that's number one. Number two is that you've got to be willing to take risk and be willing to fail.
Wow. Have you had some big failures in your time?
I have. The first community we started with in Malise in the Philippines, a squatter community, about 5,000 people. I was there at the invitation of a church, and the community leadership asked if we could help address the nutritional needs of the children. And so we started out by just raising money to offer nutrition meals that children could come in and receive nutritious meals, and began to observe that a lot of the parents and even many grandparents who were trying to take care of children were subsistence farmers, and when the crops didn't come in, there was nothing.
Yeah.
So I asked, what would it take? We had a conversation in the community about it. Well, if they could just start little micro businesses, either food carts or something like that. We figured out that for $100 a family that could be done. And so we decided that we would launch a micro lending program to start those businesses. We raised the money, came back in, had it set up. We had leadership there. But what I didn't know, even though I knew it, what I didn't realize was that people who are trying to get through today have money in their hands. They're going to spend it for food. They're going to spend it if somebody's sick. And unless you have a lot of support around that lending program, it's not going to happen. So our first initial effort was with 15 microloans. 5 of those businesses made it. The others were spent on somebody was sick, needed to go to the hospital, somebody needed food, and the leadership called me and said, okay, well, so do we go after them? And I said, no, because we failed. And so we had to relook at that, and what we did was we shifted into a cooperative model so that actually around whether it's a sewing business or a fishing business, we train the community to work together in a cooperative, and they handle the funds and they work with each other to make sure they succeed, and that has worked for us much better. I think
Well, you learn from it and you capitalize on it, right?
So, I mean, you will make mistakes if you're in there really trying to. I mean, these are systemic problems that have lasted for a long time, and they're not going to be solved overnight. And obviously, people have tried, and so there are going to be mistakes. If you can own those, if you can be careful about that, and if you can learn from them, then I think you're actually a better leader for it.
So putting yourself in people's shoes, learning from your mistakes. Other chapters?
You have to be able to raise money.
Yeah.
And so
and that's a key thing, right? A lot of nonprofit leaders want to do the good work, and they say, well, I'll hire a development person, but it's really the leader. It's important that the leadership be involved or lead.
I hate raising money. I hate asking people for money. And actually, the way we raise most of our budget is I'm an athlete, and so we run races to raise them. And I work with an organization.
So you bet people that you'll beat them, and that's you.
No, we just actually. I ran my
she
first.
Can't beat me.
I ran my first marathon after only being able to run 2 or 3 miles in order to raise this money. But so we worked with an organization called Reason to Race that actually sets up all the fundraising for you and everything else, because I'm not particularly good at that in terms of the mechanics.
Yep.
But what I learned is that the way you raise money is you tell the story. You talk from your heart, and it's not so much about saying, you do have to do the ask, but it's amazing when I start talking about these children and these young people whose lives are being changed, these communities that are being transformed. The ask is easy. And so for me, focusing on what this is really all about, but you've got to be able to raise money, and I would say along with that, you have to be very intentional about how you put your board together.
How big is your board?
Our Together and Hope board originally had 3 people. It wasn't big enough. We now have 10. For the nonprofit legal clinic that we just set up, we have 12 on that board. If you get it too big, then you never can make a decision. But particularly with having learned from the first board I set up with Together and Hope, when I went to set up the board for the legal clinics, I was very strategic. I knew that I'm almost 60. I'm not the best tweeter or all this technological stuff that these young people and my children can do.
They're great tweeters. Yes.
Right. I mean the social media piece. So I knew I needed someone who cared about this issue and who had that skill. I needed some people with financial accounting background. I need some people who are connected to wealth. I hate to be that blatant about it, but I need people who know people who have money and who know how to ask and aren't afraid to do that. I needed some people who could really communicate, who knew how to tell stories. And so you want people who are passionate about it, but just being passionate isn't enough. And you've got to have that skill set because it takes money to run a nonprofit. And there's so many wonderful nonprofits out there that you in some ways are competing for dollars, although I believe there's plenty of money out there.
If there are enough good stories, there's enough money for those places.
If you can connect people to a story, they will give.
Yeah. Talk about some of these other nonprofits. I wanted to know from you, when you look around at the landscape of nonprofits here in Houston, who strikes you as like, wow, these guys are doing a good job?
Well, one of them that I think that I work a lot with and I think does a really good job is Avance.
Oh, yeah.
Avance works primarily with education, primarily with the Hispanic community, but not exclusively.
Right.
And they provide early childhood education, which is a huge need. We have children entering school 3 years behind everybody else, and they never catch up because they just don't have access. But while they're also doing that, they work a lot with single moms who don't have education, and they help them get college education and work and everything else. So it's a very holistic model for the family, and I think they do a tremendous job. I think Children at Risk does a tremendous job.
Thanks.
I work with them on human trafficking, on early childhood education is one of your emphasis, and it works very well. Another one, kind of, as you can see, most of the ones that I work with are, deal with children or people at the margins, and that's just where my work has been. It's not that there aren't other good nonprofits in other areas, but Tahirih
they do great work.
Is an excellent. They work with women who have been victims of violence and who have come here seeking asylum or refugee status, and with a very lean budget, they do an incredible amount of work.
They do very interesting. And we've had Ann here.
Yeah.
We've also had Rick Noriega and Jose Villarreal will be here later on the semester. So we've had some of those. How about, let me ask you this, because this is a harder question. I know sometimes I look around at nonprofits in Houston and I think, wow, there's one that could be so much better. Great mission, a lot of potential. I know donors would love to give money. There's a lot of things they could be doing, but they don't have the right leadership or something is wrong. Do you see those as well? Are there some nonprofits that you think, they could be so much better?
Well, as I told you before, my sort of pet peeve is nonprofits that don't have a what I would call an appropriate ratio between administrative costs and actual program costs.
So nonprofits that raise a lot of money, but they're not spending it on what
Right,
they're
right. So they're very successful, but I have real questions about the appropriateness. Now, having of taking that amount of money out of the budget for administration. Having said that, one of the hardest things as a nonprofit is to get funding for administrative costs. And I mean, we happen to work on a very low budget and have all volunteers, but it's hard.
Yep.
And you really, to have paid staff is huge. It's also important for grants. It's much harder to get grants if you just have a volunteer staff because they don't see sustainability. So that's something we're working towards. So you have to, administration is key, and you've got to have employees that can take care of those kinds of things. But I think the appropriate ratio, is 20% administration and 80% program dollars that you should aim for. When you start out early, that's hard, but you can, as you grow into it, I think you need to. I mean, an example of that, and I'll get in trouble for this, is the Houston Rodeo. It does a tremendous job, but its overhead, I think people would be shocked, is close to 70-80% of what comes in the door. And so I don't run that, and I don't know the inner workings.
So they say they give millions of dollars to
and
scholarships,
which
is good.
Yeah.
But they're raising many, many more millions for themselves, for the rodeo themselves.
Well, that it takes that much to operate it, and maybe it does. But for me, a nonprofit ought to be, most of its dollars ought to go into programming. Yeah. And that's my personal view of things. But for me, it's a standard by which I measure others. I'll get in big trouble for this. But I work as a pastor, and I work with churches who do a lot of charitable work, particularly overseas. And the amount of money that we spend to get over there, and then the amount of money that we invest, is sometimes upside down. And oftentimes we go in with really good intentions and do good things, but it makes the community depend on us to fix it, as opposed to going in, which is much slower, much harder, and helping that community discover what it has and how seed money can be used to lift it up so that that community actually becomes sustainable. And that's a shift that in my work with the church we're trying to make, but it's hard because it's not the model that traditional missionary work has followed.
Yeah.
So my own heart and soul for the church could do a lot better. We could do a lot better.
As you talk about the amount of money spent on fundraising administration, most experts would say anywhere between 10 and 25%. Mm-hmm. But we do see lots of organizations like the one that you've mentioned where the amount spent on fundraising and administration is significantly higher than that. And we see that in schools sometimes, in private schools, in charter schools that we've shut down. So it's a good little measure to be able to look at people's financials and sort of figure that out, right?
Right, and ask. I mean, it's a good thing to ask about. And like I said, especially when you're growing, that's a hard margin. So, there probably will be a period of time when you can't meet that, but that ought to be your goal, I think.
What's the biggest mistake that nonprofits make?
I think it's, in this area of work, I think it's in trying to fix people with good intention. I mean, I think it's all well intended. I've done it myself. Instead of, we do it top down instead of this way. That's a much slower process. It's much harder to measure. And it requires being willing to allow a community to go down a road that maybe you don't think is the best way to go because you know better, and so that they can find what works for them. And so coming alongside with an accompaniment model, I think is what we need to be doing. But it's the mistake we make is I've had all this training. I am successful. I look at a situation and I know how to fix it, and so I go in and fix it. And it's not to say that there's not good work done that way, but I think the long-term impact is not what it could be. Mm-hmm.
If we were to talk to people who worked with you, both in your work at Together in Hope, but also your other work that you've done, and we were to say, hey, what's Diane's leadership style like? What would they say? What's your leadership style like?
I would say it's an accompaniment style.
Talk about that a little.
Well, so I bring people alongside of me and model what it's like. So I will go into a community and bring together folks in the community, and together we will work on the budget, we'll work on and so I think it's a mentor model.
So you're not asking them to do anything that you wouldn't do yourself
Absolutely.
or are doing yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My husband, who was in the military and has been dirty and cold and all that, and has done enough of that, says Diane will go live in a box in Ethiopia if she needs to, and I will. I mean, and I've done that. I've sat with people. Now you have to be safe. And I never take people into a situation, nor do I go in where I don't have local and people that I trust and that I know it's safe. But I think it's walking alongside people, and I do that in my work as a pastor. I did that as a lawyer, to trying to help model for people, and then you learn something too. So it's a relational model. It's immersing yourself in a community. Now, having said that, people would also say, but when Diane gets clear on something, she drives it. So I do think as leadership, you have, so our model is we don't go in and do it, and that's hard for a lot of people, and I think you have to be able to communicate that well, and you have to stick with a vision, and sometimes you have to help people get there. So it's not that you just go in and say whatever. I think my style would be, after listening deeply, I would help people kind of come up with something, and we decide that's where we're going, and I will speak that, and I will articulate that, and I will encourage people to get on board. You have to be able to sit down with people that disagree with you and listen.
Yeah.
The lawyer on me wants to win the argument, and I can, but but that doesn't work.
You can, yeah.
I mean, so we just opened this immigration legal clinic for undocumented members of our community to try to see if they have an avenue to adjust their status, how we can help them. And there are people who strongly disagree with that. And I can sit down and would like to sit down and prove to them why they're wrong, or I can sit down and have a conversation and try to really listen to what it is that they're concerned about, what their perspective is. And when they feel heard, you have a much better chance of having your message.
I've heard many leaders who sat in this chair who talk about the potential for listening, and that listening is a key component of leadership.
It is.
Many times it's women who talk about that. Women leaders talk about listening. Do you think there's a difference? This week, the TED Talk that the class is watching is the Sheryl Sandberg Lean In. What do you see a difference between men and women as leaders?
Maybe. I think some of that's cultural, that we've kind of, I think women, although that's changing, I do think it's changing. My generation, probably, women were more cultivated, if you will, to listen, and men to blaze forward. But I have been mentored by and taught by some men who were really good listeners.
Yeah.
And who have said to me, okay, Diane, what you just did was you won that argument, but you lost the battle.
Yeah.
And sat down and talked to me about maybe this might be another way. So I think culturally that probably has been true, but I think it's changing.
I think for me, I think I've learned a lot from hearing so many women talk about the importance of listening, that it's changed my leadership style, and it is an important component of leadership.
It is, yeah.
Tell me about the evolution of your leadership style, and then I'm going to go to the Twitterverse and look at the tweeted questions that people have sent in. But 30 years ago, were you a very different leader than you are today?
Absolutely. I think I had to own myself and get real comfortable with the fact that people are going to disagree with me, and be able to listen to that but not be defined by it. If you're going to be a change agent, you're going to make people angry. And so learning, I would either storm in and just win it and not get anywhere, or I'd be so intimidated by the fact that people weren't happy with me. And so learning, I think, to really own your vision is without imposing it, and be true to that and know who you are. The other thing I've learned is to surround yourself with people who can hold you accountable, but who also know your heart and your passion, and can pick you up when you fall down or when people are not, on board.
And if they're smart, that helps too.
Yeah, it's true. Well, one of the things too is recognizing that to get a job done, I don't have to be good at all of it, and learning to say, I'm really good at this, but I can't do that. I have an incredible administrative assistant, and she is my detail person because I have the vision, and then she'll go, well, you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this. And so learning to surround yourself with people who complement your strengths by bringing strengths that cover your weaknesses and allowing them a place to lead. And I think the other piece that I would say I've really learned in terms of not doing it all is that I think I'm most successful as a leader when I can bring someone to a place where I can actually step out of the way, and it's not mine, it's theirs. They've done this. This is not about me, and they can run with it instead of me always having to be the one out in front of the pack.
And that's a great lesson, right?
Yeah.
It's a great lesson to have. Let me go to the Twitterverse here. Kate Gigliotti wants to know, do you have a good book recommendation that you often recommend for emerging leaders? I don't know.
Yeah.
You do.
Well, I think From Good to Great is a great book.
That's the text for the class.
Oh, well, you did well.
Excellent book. Excellent book.
If you're interested in sort of nonprofit work around poverty and marginalization, which is where I work, and so that's why you keep hearing me talk about that, because I don't work in the art sector and all that. And I have wonderful friends who do that, and I love art. I mean, so those are all good things. It's just not where my expertise or experience is. Toxic Charities is an excellent book, and it looks at this piece of how our historical pattern for charity, if you will, has been to go in and try to fix rather than empower. And another book similar to that is called When Helping Hurts. And it talks about leadership from the standpoint of empowering the community you're serving rather than creating a situation where they depend on your leadership, but rather developing leadership that can carry it.
Do you ever recommend to your staff that they all read a particular book and you guys sort of discuss it? Have you ever done anything like that?
Yeah, we've read all three of those.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I bought I love that Tracy Kidder book about Paul Farmer, Mountains Beyond Mountains.
Yes.
I had that for the whole staff. Hardly anyone read it though. So that was a failure on my part apparently. So Rebecca Best wants to know, what helps you to stay focused to get the best end result? That's a good question.
Take care of yourself.
Yeah. Do you have a work-life balance?
I work on it. Sometimes I can tell
so
when
rare
I'm
that
out.
someone says that they have one.
I work on it. So for me, exercise is important.
Yeah.
Taking care of there's so much burnout because people who are passionate about the nonprofit work that they do, there's always more need than you can possibly address. And that's another thing I've had to learn to live into is that you have to step back and take care of yourself. And it's not only okay, it's necessary. How you eat, which is probably where I mess up the most, because I get going at a fast pace and then I just pick up stuff. But really taking care of yourself so that you're functioning at a level, and then you're also modeling that for other people.
Yeah.
And modeling is my leadership style. So I would say that's one of the things that's really important is taking care of yourself.
Excellent. John Bogucki wants to know, if you ever get really discouraged by the indifference of other leaders, government leaders, political leaders, does that discourage you sometimes?
Oh, absolutely.
It's ridiculous sometimes to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's because for me, it gets pulled into the realm of issues, and what we're really talking about is people.
Yeah.
And fear. I think we're in a time in our society where fear is driving us, and when fear drives, you can't see. So I do get discouraged, and so what's helped me is to stay focused on the change that I am able to make. And when a young woman who has was one of the first ones to go through our college program where she earned the money to put herself through college, and she graduated from college and was able to get a job in the Philippines and stood up to the graduating class and said, in my community, squatter is a derogative word. And the shame that I have carried all these years is gone because I have an education and I have a job and I'm going back to my community and I'm helping. When you can see that one person is worth it all. Now, my hope is that I can do that.
Is that a story that you tell? Is that one of your stories? Because that's
one of my
incredible.
stories. And that's what keeps me going when it gets discouraging. Because if you look at the whole pie, it feels impossible.
Yeah.
And you have to look at it because you do have to try to address systems. But when you can remember that this life has changed and this community has changed, and it may be a little piece. So Together in Hope came out of this. Actually, speaking to that, we were in Uganda, and at the time it was right after the ceasefire from the Civil War, and 50% of the population was 15 below and orphaned, 15 years old and younger. And Jack and I, my husband, went into a coffee shop in Gulu, and I just cried. We cried because we thought if we took all of our resources and threw it at this, it wouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
But if everybody did their part and changed the place they could and worked together in hope, we could change it. I believe that. I believe we could change it. And so what I have to do is stay focused on the piece that I can do. I keep calling other people into it, but they may not. And so that's how I overcome discouragement.
Wow. And that's where Together in Hope
That's where the
from.
name came from, yeah.
Very nice. Emily wants to know about organizational culture. And how do you ensure, across all the different countries that you're in, how do you ensure that the organizational culture is similar, or do you?
Well, it depends on how you define organizational culture. So for us, organizational culture is that we don't impose our culture on the culture. That's too many.
So you let each country create their own organizational culture.
Right. We bring, so for instance, as I was sharing earlier, in the Philippines after the typhoon, we had fishing industries destroyed and farming destroyed. And so we came in and listened to the community and helped them identify leadership and taught them a cooperative model that they then implemented in a form that worked for them, even in the way the bank accounts were set up and that kind of thing. So I think you bring in resources, I think you bring in training, but our culture is to allow them to mold it to what works within their context. And so the key there is for us not to impose. And that's hard sometimes because they'll come up with a model that I'll think, why would you do it that way? That's not the most efficient thing. Well, in their culture, efficiency may not be the core value. Now, you want effectiveness, but there may be something else that's impacting that's just as important as efficiency. So our organizational culture is to try to allow the community to mold it to fit what's critical for them.
Excellent. Robin Johnson wants to know, how do you select members of your board? Which is, every nonprofit goes through this, right? How do we get the right members on our board?
So finding people is part of it.
Are they all buddies of Diane?
No, actually.
That's how some people do it, right?
Some of them are.
Yeah.
Some are people that I connected with and saw a skill set in and who know the story of how Together in Hope got started and care about it partly because, came to care about it originally because they cared about me. So I do think that you use your network to find people. I have made the mistake of putting people on the board who just were there for that and didn't really have the time and really didn't have a skill set to bring to it other than they thought it was a great idea and they wanted to, support me. But I also think, there are lots of other ways. We two of our great board members we found through the United Way Board Fair.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a great way to go and let people, it's a great way to talk to people about your organization, let them come and see. So a lot of times you have young people coming out of law school or graduate school or just getting into business, and they want to get connected, they want to give back, but they don't really know what's out there. And so there are avenues like that. I do think you have to screen people well and be honest with them. And they need to be honest with you about whether it's a fit. And a couple of folks that came on board originally through that didn't work out, and we both realized this was not the fit for them. And so you have to be willing to kind of shift and change as you see that, remain flexible.
And do you have limits on your board? Do you board terms and limits on their terms?
Our board is renewable every 3 years. So they serve for a 3-year term, and they can be reappointed by a majority of the board to serve another 3.
And can they go even another 3
after that? They can go another 3, yeah.
They could
keep
going?
For us, we're small enough. For some of the others, it may be. You may need to do more turnover.
Have you ever had a board member that was horrible and you've had to say, you're going to have to leave the board?
Didn't come to meetings, didn't help with any. I hate fundraising, but if you're going to be on a board, you're going to have to help with it. And you have to find a way that works for you, and just wanted to be listed. That looks great on a resume.
Do your board members go with you sometimes to the Philippines or Ethiopia?
We try to. We try to take really small teams that are designed.
They pay for themselves, though.
Yes, and they're selected based on either because they're on the board and it helps them better tell the story, which is really important. Being able to communicate your story is key. I mean, you can't do the work and you can't raise the money if you can't communicate that story well. And if you sort of have to come and see in some way. But other people that we take, sometimes donors, we try to do it more in terms of whether there's a skill set that the community needs training in. We in some of the communities where we work in the Philippines, they said they could get contracts for making garments and rugs like that if they could develop a sewing center. So we helped them put together a sewing cooperative, and we brought people over who could teach them how to sew all kinds of things. So whenever we build something, we actually hire local labor. And there's where the cultural organization is important, because the way they do construction in the Philippines is not necessarily the way they do it here. But we did bring some construction engineers and electricians and things like that that could oversee that and help that be done well. But we try to limit the numbers so that it's not about us, but really about the community.
Moises Fabela wants to know, do you ever have people who say, maybe you should be serving, there's a lot of work to be done in the United States rather than abroad? How do you respond to that, and what do you think?
I agree with them. That's why I do 2 jobs. There is a huge need here. And I do think there's a culture of let's go fix it over there. And I think one of the reasons, particularly in the church, which is where I do a lot of my work, and I love the church, but because it's easy to go over there and deal with the poverty there for a couple weeks and then come back and live the way I live, which is very nice compared to the rest of the world, and I like it. I mean, if we're honest, and I struggle with that. But if I'm going to address, so I live in Bel Air, which is upper middle class, if not upper class.
It's nice.
2 miles from my house is Gulfton, where we have people living.
One of the largest immigrant communities in America.
And 3 or 4 families living in 1-bedroom apartments, and there's a lot of poverty. And I don't really want to see that, because it means that every day I have to change the way I live, and I think that's harder. So yes, we absolutely need to be working here, and Together in Hope's actually been has helped participate in some of the immigration work that we've done with the legal clinic and otherwise, because it impacts our communities. But I think it's important that we don't. The poverty that's here is hard. I think in some ways harder to get at because we have more regulations in the United States than perhaps some other places. But we need to be working here, and that's why I do 2 jobs.
There's so much work to be done here. Rand Omran wants to know, and this is a big issue right now in nonprofits, is sort of measuring, sort of metrics. What do you guys do around that? I mean, you have good stories. Are you using metrics, or is that all you can do right now?
We do. So for us, on the educational end, we work on preschools for kids that don't have access, and they work on getting children who can't go to college do that. And so we measure the number of kids that actually enter the system. Now, we started in 2009. We haven't been around long enough to see whether those kids make it all the way through. Yeah. But we do try to keep track of that. With our college students, one of the challenges in the Philippines, as I was sharing earlier, is that the Philippines exports 1/5 of its population for labor because there's no work. And that puts them at tremendous risk of trafficking and other sorts of things when they go abroad. And so trying to figure out how many of those kids actually are able to enter some kind of employment safely or develop, we try to help them figure out small businesses perhaps they can run. So we track that. And the cooperatives have been in existence for probably about 5 years, different places, and so we track whether or not, they're actually able to sustain income and that kind of thing. But I think, particularly if you're looking for grant money, being able to track and give metrics and outcomes. So there again it is. I mean, we go in and do a lot of, our pattern typically as nonprofits is going to do a lot of stuff and it feels good, but is it actually making any kind of change? And I think we need to measure that, because if it's not, maybe we need to look at whether or not this is the most effective way to do. So I do think that's important. There are some things, we were talking about this earlier, in the Philippine communities where we work with putting kids in preschool, if they can't eat, they're not going to do well. And so, we're adding a nutritional piece that seems to be improving school performance, but that's a little bit harder to measure. I mean, people need to eat. Yeah. And that's much harder long-term to develop sustainability. I think you have to have that as your goal. But while we, in this country, struggle with excess, yep. I think we have an obligation to try to make sure that at least the rest of the world can eat.
Yeah.
And I think that's an obligation whether you can measure it or not. Now, whether you're interrupting the economy, that's a whole nother.
Yeah, it is. Jordan Klein wants to know, with so many countries that could benefit from your programs, how do you choose the next country that you're going to expand to?
Well, actually, I think one of the mistakes we made early on is that I want to save the world. I want to end poverty. I don't want any child to be living in poverty. And we probably cast the net too wide. And so I think it's more important to focus in one area and do it really well. And with the small budget we have and the model that we have, we're probably not going to expand for a while. But it's been by invitation, and so we have never gone in and imposed ourselves anywhere. And so that has just come because of other work that I've done. We've gotten a call and said, would you come in and talk to us and look at what we could do? But I think my mistake early on was I kept saying yes because I wanted to help everybody.
Your model of using in-country people, I know plenty of organizations that don't do that, right? They have a country director and country staff. But are you seeing more and more other organizations do this where you use in-country people more than not?
I do. I think I think in the nonprofit world, particularly where you're working around issues of poverty and economic development, that there's a paradigm shift that's occurring. Yeah. And it's a shift from, I think we're realizing that this go in and fix it and impose ourselves on a community has not been as fruitful long-term as we would hope it would have been. And so I think there's a shift that's happening that we're trying to learn to live into. How do we really hand off to the community, even locally? What does it mean to lift up leadership within the community? So it's this model of asset-based community development. What are the assets there, and how do you empower those as opposed to creating this dependency model?
Do you find yourself doing leadership training of a sort within some of those communities that you go into?
Yes. Yeah. So, we actually do that. We sit down and talk about how can you help lead this community and learning to listen. But part of what you also do is sit down and listen to what is it that the community honors and values, that is respected in the community. So a big part of that is really just trying to help them organize and listen to what they already know and help them live into that.
Alrighty. Christian Arnold wants to know if you run into opposition from local governments as you do some of your work.
What we do, we really haven't. Now, having said that, so for example, in Ethiopia, we got an invitation to come in and look at what we could do around street children in Diradao because of connections that we had. And what we learned fast was that Ethiopia is very restrictive because of this history of I wouldn't say abuse, but nonprofits not helping as much as perhaps they should have. They're very restrictive about who can function as a nonprofit in Ethiopia. So we had to go in and find a partner that was already there and work that way. So in the Philippines, we had to figure out the licensing procedures and make sure that we honored those. And we had, in one of our communities, we had developed, they were making jewelry and handbags and things like that to sell. And we had a visit from someone saying, "Do you have a license?" We're like, "Oh, do we need one of those?" So we got a license really fast. But so, no, I mean, we're very careful about how money is handled. I think you get in trouble when money gets funneled through government officials because, or even, you have to be very careful in places of poverty how money is handled because the corruption is understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, so, but other than that, not really.
Maya Bean has an interesting question. How did you decide, it's specific, how did you decide to partner with Youth Release, the group Youth Release?
Well, actually, we were working, I was in Hungary and I met Laura Power, who was graduating from a college in Ireland and had been working in Ethiopia. And she's the one who invited us to come and see. And I was so impressed with her, I actually brought her here on H-1B visa. And she worked for us for 4 years, and then she needed to be home with family. But it was by invitation, and so they had started, Youth Release was really out of these young people in Ireland who wanted to make a difference with these street children in Ethiopia, and were looking for a partner. And so it was, again, by invitation. We sat down and vetted them, and they vetted us and decided that I believe in partners. Most of the issues that we try to address, that you try to address, we're learning we can't do it alone. We really have to partner if we're going to do this well.
So many people have been tweeting in questions. It's just amazing. So Carla Jones Adams wants to know that she also doesn't like this whole idea of fundraising. And so when you hate fundraising, how do you raise money? I mean, it's sort of an interesting question. If you're starting a nonprofit, so if Carla's out there starting her own nonprofit, how does she get going when this is the part she doesn't want to do?
I think
she has to get over that.
You do have to get over that, and so I think you need to feel really good about having at least an initial structure, which is going to change because as you live into any of this, you'll learn. But an initial structure that says, if you give this many dollars, this is how it's going to be used, so that you can feel confident that what you're asking people to give you can tell them is going to be well used. Then I think the secret is telling the story of why this matters to you. Why are you doing this? What is it that's in your heart? What do you see, and what do you believe you can accomplish, and why do you believe that? And that needs to be told really well, and you need to feel really comfortable that that's true. And that you can stand behind it with some, you'll fail at some of it, but and then you go tell that story. To this day, I still don't like it, but it's a necessary thing that you have to do. And then you find some other people who aren't as uncomfortable as you are to help you. Some people love doing it,
right.
And it's a gift if you can find those people.
I actually love raising money. Tell me, which is why I teach the fundraising class here as well.
Well, maybe I need to take it.
In regards to your budget, do you get any money from grants or corporations, or is it all just fundraisers and individual giving for you?
Ours is all individual giving. We haven't said we did get a Google grant that we were able to use for technology, so to be able to help communicate our story and that kind of thing. Partly because we're living into, what is measurable grant. Now, I have gotten grants for the legal clinic that we set up. We actually applied for a $100,000 matching grant. And matching grants are a great way to do fundraising because people like to give when you can tell them this is, we're going to get this. And and so, the thing about a matching grant is it depends on you raising it, but also we raised the matching $100 much faster than we would have been able to if we had not gotten a $100,000 matching grant. So the key in grant writing, I'm not the best grant writer in the world though, is that you really need to look at what they're looking for and you need to be able to describe how what you're doing fits with the agenda of the granting entity.
I'll do one last question. We'll do it fast, and then I'll ask you a couple of quick ones. Michelle Cordier wants to know, this model that you use in the Philippines and in other countries, could we use it here?
I think so.
Yeah.
We try to do it. I mean, we're learning to do it. In the U.S., you have a lot more restrictions around developing businesses and that kind of things, but it's doable.
Yeah.
And absolutely, there's a lot of work being done here around what I've referred to before as asset-based community development. And that's really about building relationships in communities and then helping empower what's there. We do bring resources to the table and we do bring resources there. But it's the model we need to be using here. We don't need to be fixing people here, but we do need to, and that's not saying pull people up, people can pull them up by their own bootstraps, because I think there's a lot of cases where that's not true. They don't have access. So the model here would be really, I think, about access. Access to education, access to employment opportunities, access to finances and training around banking and all that. So, but yes, absolutely, it could work here, and that's the way we should be doing it. I think that's my opinion.
Okay, our final 4 questions. When you look around the world, Diane, where's been one of your favorite little sort of spots that maybe people don't know about or haven't heard much about, but you thought, wow, this is a great little spot?
Just a spot that I love?
Yeah.
Indonesia.
Indonesia? Is there like a beach in Indonesia or a place?
The interior of Bali. I actually have gone a number of times and stayed in the community, not the touristy stuff, and learned from the indigenous people, their faith tradition and how they worship in their temples and how their culture works, and tried to just immerse. And it's a beautiful culture. It's a beautiful part of the world. It's probably my favorite place.
Wow, very good. Do you have a favorite little secret place in Houston?
Secret? Well, I'm an ocean person. That's where I remember how small I am and how big my God is. And so it's also a place where I get really clear. Otherwise, there's a neat little place over off of, I mean, my own personal sort of restorative practice is contemplative prayer. Yeah. And there's a neat little retreat center called the Cynical over off of Memorial and Kirby, and I love going over there. It's just a delightful little place. But I'm an outdoor person, so I'm up usually at 5 to watch the sunrise, and that's my being outside in nature is, which is hard in this weather, but got to get really early.
It is hard in this weather. Your favorite restaurant in Houston?
My favorite restaurant in Houston. We eat at Morton's all the time because that's my husband's favorite restaurant. What's my favorite restaurant?
Yours. You don't have to go always where your husband goes.
No, I know. I don't eat out a whole lot. There's a great little taqueria right down on the corner of Broadway and 45. There's a church right there, and on the other side is this little taqueria, and the people are wonderful.
Do you remember the name of the taqueria?
It's just I just go in there all the time, but you can find it. It's right there on the corner, and it's just the food's just great. I mean, I love Mexican food, and it's authentic Mexican food, and it's just a neat little community place. I think that's probably my favorite place.
It'd be hard for me to find a bad taqueria
That's
in
true.
Houston.
That's
I mean,
true.
there's so many great places. And then our final big question, Diane, who would play you in a movie? So they're doing the Diane McGehee story, the Together in Hope movie. Who's going to play you?
Who's going to play me?
Yeah.
Who is going to play me? I don't know what her name is.
Okay.
But she's the woman who played Alice in the Johnny Depp version of Alice in Wonderland.
Oh, I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
Huh.
I just, maybe because what she embodied in that movie, my favorite line of that movie was, I imagine 6 impossible things before breakfast every day. And that's what I try to do.
Oh, wow. Diane McGehee, Together in Hope. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you for letting
and thank
me.
you for sharing your leadership
Thank
lessons.
you.
Very good. Hey, we will see you guys next week back here in the Leadership Studio. Until then, work hard. Take care.